one of the darkest, most disturbing events in Sri Lanka's modern history, a massacre that didn't happen in a war zone, but behind the high walls of a prison. This is the story of the Welikada prison massacre, a brutal and haunting episode that unfolded during the chaos of Black July 1983, when the country was gripped by deadly ethnic violence and lawlessness. In July 1983, Sri Lanka was a nation on edge. Tensions between the Sinhalese majority and the Tamil minority had been simmering for years, with political mistrust, social discrimination, and rising militancy all fueling the fire. When 13 Sinhalese soldiers were killed by the Tamil Tigers in an ambush in the north, the reaction was swift and violent. Riots exploded across the country in what became known as Black July. Tamil homes, shops, and lives were destroyed by Sinhalese mobs in broad daylight, while authorities either turned a blind eye or failed to intervene. The country was on fire, both literally and figuratively. Amid this chaos stood Welikada Prison in Colombo, one of the largest and most secure prison facilities in the country. Inside its walls were Tamil political prisoners and suspected militants, many of whom had been detained under emergency laws. They were held in state custody, stripped of their freedom, but still under the protection of the law. That protection, however, was tragically absent when the violence reached inside those prison walls. On July 25, 1983, the first massacre occurred. A group of Sinhalese inmates, somehow armed with weapons, launched a brutal and coordinated attack on the Tamil prisoners. What followed was a horrifying bloodbath. 35 Tamil inmates were killed, hacked and beaten to death in what should have been a controlled and secure environment. The guards, whose job was to maintain order and safety, either failed to act or disappeared altogether. Locked doors were inexplicably left open. Weapons that shouldn't have existed in a prison were suddenly in the hands of attackers, and the violence unfolded with disturbing ease. After this massacre, authorities promised tighter security. Extra guards were assigned. Everyone expected the worst to be over. But just 2 days later, on July 27th, the violence returned with horrifying familiarity. Another 18 Tamil prisoners were killed in a second wave of attacks. That brought the total death toll to 53. These were not spontaneous outbursts of violence. They were targeted killings, carried out with shocking coordination and apparent complicity. Despite the scale of the atrocity, accountability never followed. No prison officials faced meaningful consequences. No thorough investigation was made public. The story faded into the background, buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and political silence. The massacre became a symbol, not just of racial hatred, but of the utter breakdown of justice and institutional responsibility. The Welikada prison massacre didn't happen in some remote jungle or in the fog of war. It happened in the heart of the capital, under the nose of the state, inside a prison where every movement was supposed to be monitored. The fact that such a tragedy could occur in such a setting spoke volumes about the environment of the time, one where fear, racism, and violence had replaced order and accountability. For the families of the victims, there was no closure, no justice, no one to answer for what happened. The massacre left a permanent scar, not just on those who lost their loved ones, but on the conscience of an entire nation. It exposed the depth of ethnic division and the extent to which state institutions could fail or refuse to protect those in their custody. Even today, the Welikada prison massacre remains one of the most brutal examples of state negligence in Sri Lanka's post-independence history. It stands as a grim reminder of what can happen when hate is allowed to fester and when the guardians of justice become bystanders to murder. This was not just a prison riot. It was an organized massacre that reflected the darkest impulses of a society in collapse. The names of the 53 Tamil prisoners may not be widely known, but their story deserves to be told, not as a forgotten tragedy, but as a warning, a lesson, and a call to never let history repeat itself. It was supposed to be a peaceful family getaway, just sand, sun, and memories made by the ocean. On October 9, 2024, the Graves family gathered on Dauphin Island, Alabama, to enjoy one of those rare, golden days where generations come together. laughing, unwinding, soaking in each other's company. But that day would become etched in their hearts forever for a reason no one saw coming. Charles Chuck Graves was the kind of man who held families together. A devoted husband, proud father, loving grandfather. At 75, he wasn't one to sit on the sidelines of life. His heart was full of stories, some from his time in the Navy, some from the decades working hard to provide, and most from the moments he cherished with his grandchildren. That day, he was watching them play in the shallows. Then, everything changed. A rip current, a silent, swift force, caught his 5-year-old grandson. In an instant, the child was pulled farther from shore, his small frame no match for the water's strength. Shouts echoed, panic surged, and without hesitation, Chuck moved. No second thoughts, no fear, just action. He dove into the current, his body cutting through the waves with a determination that defied his age. He reached the boy, secured him, and passed him to another family member, safe, alive, out of danger. But something was wrong. Chuck didn't follow them back. He didn't swim toward shore. He simply floated, still. For a terrifying moment, his family thought he might be drowning. But it wasn't the water that had claimed him. It was his heart. The effort, the adrenaline, the overwhelming toll of the rescue had triggered a fatal heart attack. First responders rushed to his aid. They pulled him from the surf and airlifted him to the hospital. But the damage had already been done. The man who had given everything for his family had taken his final breath doing what he always did, protecting them. His daughter-in-law, Valerie Belt, would later say they believed he knew something was wrong, that maybe in those last moments he felt it. But even then, he chose to save his grandson first, because that's who Chuck was. Born in Paducah, Kentucky, he'd spent a life working hard and loving harder. After 4 years of service in the U.S. Navy and a career at a power plant, Chuck retired to Estero, Florida, where he spent his days fishing and planning trips to see his kids and grandkids. He and his wife Maura had been married since 1975, closing in on 50 years of partnership filled with laughter, love, and the kind of small moments that grow into legacies. He never missed a chance to bring the family together. He wanted them all in one place, sharing meals, telling stories, watching the little ones run barefoot through the sand. He lived for that. And when it came down to one final moment, he died for it too. The grandson he saved survived because of his courage, and the family he left behind will forever carry the weight and wonder of what he did that day. There's no medal that could capture what Chuck Graves gave, no ceremony that could fully honor what he meant. But in the heart of a little boy who still gets to grow up, and in the quiet strength of a family that knows their patriarch died a hero, his legacy will live on. Some heroes wear uniforms, others carry fishing rods, tell corny jokes, and never miss a birthday. Chuck was one of those, the kind of man who, when the moment came, didn't hesitate. And in that final, unforgettable act, he showed what love really looks like. In what should have been the happiest chapter of their lives, Ben and Catherine Mullany's story took a heartbreaking and unthinkable turn. The couple, both 31 and newly married, had just tied the knot in a beautiful ceremony in Pontardawe, Wales, surrounded by friends, family, and hopes for a future filled with adventure, career milestones, and quiet Sunday mornings. Ben, a former South Wales police officer who had recently started training as a physiotherapist, and Catherine, a freshly qualified doctor, were the kind of couple you'd root for, grounded, loving, and full of dreams. And where better to kick off a new life together than on the sun-drenched shores of Antigua, a tropical escape that looks like something off a honeymoon brochure. They had chosen the Cocos Hotel, a stunning cliffside resort on the island's west coast, known for its private cottages, panoramic sea views, and the kind of relaxed vibe that makes you forget your phone password. Their honeymoon was going swimmingly. Lazy beach days, island sunsets, romantic dinners, you know, all the good stuff. But as their dream trip neared its end, the unthinkable happened. In the early hours of July 27, 2008, just hours before they were due to fly home, Two men broke into their bungalow in what was believed to be a robbery gone horrifically wrong. What unfolded was brutal. The intruders, Caniel Martin and Avi Howell, were both in their early 20s and armed with a gun. They forced Ben and Catherine to kneel beside their bed and then shot them both in the back of the head. Catherine died instantly. Ben, somehow, incredibly, survived the initial shooting. He was airlifted back to the UK in a desperate attempt to save his life, but despite the efforts of doctors, including some of Catherine's colleagues, he passed away a week later, never regaining consciousness. It was a story that gripped the UK and Antigua alike. Two bright young professionals with their whole lives ahead of them, taken in the most senseless and devastating way imaginable. The murder investigation was fast-tracked, and the Antiguan authorities, with help from UK officers, moved quickly. The suspects, Martin and Howell, weren't exactly strangers to law enforcement. They had a history of violent behavior and were soon linked to the crime through DNA, ballistics, and the stolen items traced back to them. Shockingly, the pair were also charged with another murder, that of 43-year-old local shopkeeper Juanita Anderson, killed in her store just 2 weeks after the Mullaneys were shot. Their spree of violence left a trail of grief in its wake, and the courtroom was packed when the case went to trial in 2011. Over weeks of testimony, the jury heard harrowing details of the couple's final moments and the forensic evidence that sealed the killer's fate. Both Martin and Howell were found guilty on all counts. While Antigua technically still has the death penalty on the books, the judge decided the case didn't meet the threshold of the worst, the legal requirement for capital punishment. So they were sentenced to life imprisonment. Not one life sentence, but 3 each. They'll be spending the rest of their lives behind bars, far from the paradise they destroyed. Out of this unimaginable tragedy, something positive emerged. Determined to preserve Ben and Catherine's memory and continue their legacy, their families established the Mullany Fund. The charity supports students pursuing careers in health and medicine, fields that the couple had devoted themselves to. It's the kind of legacy that turns grief into purpose and pain into progress. Through scholarships and community support, the Mullany Fund has helped young people follow in Ben and Catherine's footsteps, giving back to a world that took so much from them. The murders also shook Antigua's tourism industry and triggered a national conversation about crime and public safety. With international attention focused on the island, officials were pushed to reassess law enforcement procedures and tighten security around resorts. It was a wake-up call, one that led to reforms, but also left a lasting scar on the island's reputation. More than a decade later, the story of Ben and Catherine Mullany still resonates, not just as a tragic tale of a honeymoon gone horribly wrong, but as a reminder of how fragile life can be. Their names live on through the lives they've touched, the students they've inspired, and the love they left behind. It's a story with heartbreak at its core, yes, but also one that shows how, even in the darkest moments, humanity can find a way to carry the light forward. Oh boy, buckle up, because we're diving into one of the wildest, most chaotic, totally not okay prison meltdowns in U.S. history. The 1980 New Mexico State Penitentiary riot, aka the moment the correctional system threw its hands up and said, "I'm out." Picture this. It's a chilly February weekend in Santa Fe, 1980, and the Penitentiary of New Mexico is basically a pressure cooker of rage, frustration, and very poor life choices. We're talking about a place jam-packed with over 1,100 inmates, many of them stuffed into dormitories like sardines, with zero rehabilitation programs, almost no medical care, and guards who were underpaid, undertrained, and honestly, probably undercaring. So it's no surprise that something was about to snap, and snap it did, harder than a cheap pair of handcuffs. Around 1:40 a.m. on February 2nd, a few inmates decided they'd had enough of the terrible chow and being treated like livestock. They tricked some guards during a late-night head count, jumped them, and boom, within minutes, keys were stolen, control rooms were taken, and just like that, the inmates had the whole joint in their hands. What followed wasn't just a riot, It was a full-blown, apocalyptic horror movie meets revenge fantasy, minus the popcorn. Inmates went full Mad Max on each other. They broke into cell blocks, especially one called Cell Block 4, which housed the snitches, ex-cops, and folks who didn't exactly make friends in prison. Once the mob got in, it was lights out for a lot of guys. 33 inmates ended up dead, and we're not talking about quiet, peaceful goodbyes. This was gruesome, medieval-level stuff. We're talking torture, dismemberment, and just plain nightmarish violence. It got so intense that some inmates were literally begging guards to save them, and guards, some of whom had been taken hostage, were powerless to stop it. Oh yeah, did I mention the guards? About 12 of them were taken hostage in the early chaos, some beaten, some humiliated, and a few narrowly escaping death thanks to inmates who surprisingly decided to play hero. Not all prisoners were part of the madness. Some actually hid, others tried to help the wounded, and a few even risked their lives to protect staff. So, while the riot was chaos, there were flashes of humanity, buried deep in all that mayhem. Now, how did this whole nightmare end? Well, after 36 hours, yes, 36 hours of non-stop violence, destruction, and probably the worst-smelling facility in America, state police and the National Guard rolled in, gas masks and all. The inmates were exhausted. The prison was wrecked beyond recognition, and the riot eventually fizzled out. But the aftermath, yikes. The facility looked like a war zone. Walls were blackened by fires, furniture was smashed, files were torched, and blood was kind of everywhere. Investigators walked in and probably thought, yeah, we broke prison. The riot exposed just how broken the prison system was in New Mexico. Overcrowded, underfunded, mismanaged, and running on fumes. The government couldn't sweep this one under the rug. Reforms followed, reports were written, heads rolled, and the riot became a grim lesson in what happens when you ignore a boiling pot until it explodes in your face. So next time you think your workplace is chaotic, just remember, at least your coworkers aren't literally trying to eat each other. The 1980 New Mexico State Penitentiary riot, where everything that could go wrong absolutely did, and then somehow got even worse. It was February 24th, 2022. Ukraine trembled under the first wave of the Russian invasion. Chaos erupted as Russian forces pushed their way into the country, fast and ruthless. Every moment mattered. Every road, every bridge, critical. One of those was the Henichesk Bridge in Kherson Province, a lifeline that connected Russian-occupied Crimea to mainland Ukraine. If Russian troops crossed it, the path into Ukraine's heartland would be wide open. The stakes? Nothing less than the fate of a nation. There was only one option: destroy the bridge. The man given that impossible task was just 25 years old. Vitaly Skakun Volodymyrovich, a combat engineer with the Ukrainian Marines. But to the people who knew him, he was much more than that. Born on August 19, 1996 in the small town of Berezhany in western Ukraine, Vitaly had grown up with a quiet determination. He went to school where his mother taught, studied welding, and even worked construction in Poland. He wasn't the kind of guy who looked for recognition, but when duty called, he answered, always. On that cold morning, with Russian tanks rumbling ever closer, Vitaly's unit received the order: rig the Henichesk bridge with explosives and bring it down before the enemy could cross. The mission was dangerous. The timing had to be perfect. One mistake could mean capture or death. Vitaly didn't hesitate. He volunteered. Under intense pressure, he worked quickly, planting mines under the bridge as the thunder of war grew louder in the distance. He could hear them coming. The Russian forces were moving in fast, too fast. As he finished the setup, a chilling realization set in. There wasn't enough time to escape. He made the call. One last message to his unit, his voice calm despite to do. Moments later, the bridge erupted in fire and smoke. The explosion shattered the silence and the Russian advance. The enemy was stopped in its tracks. Vitaly was gone, but his sacrifice bought Ukraine precious time time to regroup, time to resist, time to fight back. 2 days later, the president of Ukraine posthumously awarded him the Order of the Gold Star, Ukraine's highest military honor. The military confirmed what everyone already knew. Vitaly's sacrifice wasn't just brave. It was the kind of courage most people only read about, the kind that changes the course of history. His comrades mourned him deeply. One soldier remembered the last words they heard. He contacted us and told us what he was going to do. Shortly after, the explosion happened. They all knew what he'd done and why he'd done it. Word of his act didn't stay within Ukraine's borders. His name echoed around the world. People from every corner of the globe shared his story. In his hometown of Berezhany, the community gathered to say goodbye, heads bowed and hearts heavy. Images from his funeral were shared widely, heartbreaking, solemn, unforgettable. His legacy grew beyond his homeland. A street in Prague was proposed to be renamed in his honor. He was granted honorary citizenship in both Berezhany and Leszno, Poland, where he once worked. These weren't just symbolic gestures. They were reminders that courage like his touches lives far beyond a battlefield. Ukraine's military leaders called him a symbol of resilience. They vowed to fight on with his memory in their hearts. The Henichesk bridge, once a key target, had become something more, a symbol of resistance, a line drawn in fire and blood. People still ask, what if he'd escaped? What if he'd found a way out? Would the Russians have crossed faster? Would Ukrainian troops have had the time they needed to prepare? No one can answer those questions. On April 17, 2025, what was supposed to be a peaceful, scenic ride up a mountain in southern Italy turned into a horrifying tragedy. The Monte Fito cable car, which usually offers stunning views of the Bay of Naples and a gentle escape from the bustling streets below, became the center of a devastating accident when one of its cabins suddenly fell more than 100 feet into a ravine. 4 lives were lost, 1 person was critically injured, and questions began pouring in faster than rescue crews could reach the scene. The victims included a British couple, Elaine and Graham Wynne, who were enjoying retirement and living out their dream of traveling the world. Also on board was Janan Suleiman, a young Arab-Israeli woman, and Carmine Parlato, the Italian cable car operator who was just doing his job that day. Janan's brother, Thabe Suleiman, somehow survived the fall with serious injuries and was rushed to the hospital, where he was later reported to be in stable condition. To make things worse, there was another cabin filled with 16 passengers that ended up stranded in the air. Imagine being stuck mid-air, dangling over the mountains, with no idea what just happened or if you were next. Thankfully, all of them were safely rescued, although the weather wasn't exactly on their side. Thick fog and 60-mile-per-hour winds made the operation incredibly dangerous and difficult. What caused this tragedy? Early reports pointed to a snapped cable. Now, in most cable car systems, when something goes wrong with the main traction cable, an emergency brake is supposed to kick in. That's the safety net. But in this case, it looks like the brake didn't do its job. That's one of the key things investigators are digging into. The Italian authorities launched a full-blown manslaughter investigation to figure out whether this was a freak mechanical failure, human error, or something else entirely. The timing of it all adds another layer to the story. The cable car had only reopened 10 days earlier, following routine seasonal maintenance. That naturally raised eyebrows. Was something missed? Was a shortcut taken? It's still under investigation, but people want answers, and fast. The public, understandably, is shaken, and officials are under serious pressure to review safety protocols across all cable car systems in the country. Monte Fito's cable car has been a fixture in the region since 1952. It's not just a mode of transportation. It's a part of local life and a tourist favorite. But this isn't the first time it's been involved in a fatal accident. Back in 1960, a pylon collapsed, killing 4 people. History, repeating itself 65 years later, has only added to the heartbreak and the sense of urgency to ensure this never happens again. The response across Italy was one of shock and sorrow. Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, who happened to be in Washington at the time, publicly expressed her condolences. Locals, tourists, and the international community alike mourned the loss of lives that day. It was a grim reminder that even something as serene as a cable car ride can carry risks when systems fail. In the end, this incident wasn't just a mechanical disaster. It was a human one. It affected families, shattered travel dreams, and raised tough questions about safety and oversight. As the investigation continues, the hope is that out of this tragedy will come reform, accountability, and better protections to prevent something like this from ever happening again. Let's rewind to 1971, to a small town in upstate New York where something explosive was brewing inside the walls of Attica Correctional Facility. Overcrowded, under-resourced, and racially divided, the prison had become a pressure cooker. Inmates were living under harsh conditions, only one shower a week, barely any medical care, censored mail, and a diet that could have made cardboard look appetizing. More than half the prison population was Black or Latino, but almost all the guards were white, and racism was practically baked into the system. Tensions had been simmering for years, and on September 9th, the lid finally blew off. It started with a scuffle between inmates and guards, but what followed was far more than just a fight. Over 1,200 inmates took control of the prison's D-yard, taking 42 staff members hostage. But instead of descending into chaos, the inmates organized. They issued a clear and powerful list of 27 demands, calling for basic human rights: decent food, health care, education, fair treatment, and amnesty for the uprising. They weren't asking for luxury, they were asking for dignity. For 4 tense days, the prison yard turned into a political stage. The inmates brought in observers, activists, journalists, even public figures like civil rights attorney William Kunstler and Black Panther leader Bobby Seale to help with negotiations. Their message was firm, but peaceful. They were determined to be heard. But outside the walls, Governor Nelson Rockefeller refused to meet the inmates face-to-face, despite public pressure. And on the morning of September 13th, without warning, he gave the green light for a violent retake. In came hundreds of heavily armed state troopers, correction officers, and sheriff's deputies. Tear gas rained down. Guns opened fire. Chaos erupted. In just 15 minutes, 39 people were killed, 29 inmates and 10 hostages. And here's the chilling truth. Every single hostage was killed by law enforcement gunfire, not by the inmates. Despite this, officials initially claimed the prisoners had murdered the hostages, an outright lie that was quickly exposed by autopsies. The public was outraged. What followed was a storm of lawsuits, investigations, and long overdue scrutiny of the U.S. prison system. The Attica uprising became a defining moment, a symbol of resistance against inhumane treatment behind bars, and a stark reminder of how quickly justice can unravel when fear takes over. The prisoners had tried to negotiate. They had asked to be heard. Instead, their cries were met with bullets. Decades later, Attica is still more than just the name of a prison. It's a powerful warning, a call to remember what happens when systems fail and voices are ignored. It forced the nation to confront ugly truths about racism, inequality, and brutality in places most people never see. And while some reforms did come in its wake, many of the same issues, overcrowding, neglect, abuse, still linger in prisons across the country. It was November 11th, 2024. Children at the Macedon Ranges Montessori preschool were playing in the safety of their fenced-in yard, completely unaware of the danger that was about to tear through their world. Then came the sound. At first, it didn't register, just another truck on the nearby road, but then it swerved. A water tanker, massive and out of control, veered violently from the street. In a split second, the vehicle was no longer on the road. It was inside the playground. In the middle of it all was 43-year-old Eleanor Bryant, a speech pathologist. She didn't hesitate. The moment she saw the truck barreling toward them, she acted. She ran straight into its path, not away from it. Her focus was pure. The children. Get them out. Push them to safety. Save them. Local resident Walter Lucas watched it unfold from across the street. "She saved that kid's life by putting herself in danger," he later said. "She's more than a hero. She's a superhero." But there wasn't enough time. Eleanor managed to shield several children, guiding them to safety. She even got the child she was working with out of the truck's direct path, but she couldn't save herself. The tanker struck her. The impact was fatal. She died on the scene. The driver, a 68-year-old man from Broadford, was seriously injured. Emergency responders rushed him to the hospital, but he was in no condition to speak. Authorities suspected a medical episode caused the crash, but they needed time to confirm it. The preschool was closed. For Riddell's Creek, a town familiar with the distant thunder of passing trucks but not with this kind of grief, it was more than a tragedy. It was a wound that wouldn't heal quickly. Eleanor's family were devastated. Flowers appeared at the preschool gates. The 3-year-old boy she saved was rushed to Royal Children's Hospital. His injuries were serious, but he was alive because of her. Beyond the preschool, Eleanor was a cornerstone of her community. She was the uniform coordinator for a local basketball club, the kind of person who worked behind the scenes without expecting credit. The club's social media tribute called her an amazing mom and wife who gave everything. Authorities are still reviewing CCTV footage, looking for answers. The cause, whether it was a medical event, mechanical failure, or something else, is still being pieced together. But for many in Riddell's Creek, the investigation is background noise to the deafening silence left in One of the most intense moments in Hajj history, the 2006 stampede in Mina, near Mecca, Saudi Arabia. It happened on January 12th during the Hajj pilgrimage, right in the middle of the stoning of the devil ritual. This ritual involves millions of pilgrims symbolically pelting 3 large pillars with pebbles as a gesture of resisting evil. It's one of the most crowded events in an already packed pilgrimage, and the energy is high. The temperatures are sweltering, and the crowd is jammed shoulder to shoulder like a human sea in white robes. Everyone is focused, emotional, and determined to complete this sacred rite. But on that particular day, chaos broke loose. A single stumble, likely caused by someone tripping over a bag, or maybe just an unlucky foot placement, caused a chain reaction. Within seconds, people started falling. Those behind had no idea what was happening and continued to move forward, unaware that the front had turned into a crushing zone. The result was devastating. Bodies piled, people screamed, and the already overwhelming crowd became a death trap. Emergency responders rushed in, but the damage was already done. By the end of it, at least 360 people had lost their lives, with hundreds more injured. Sandals, bags, and personal belongings were left scattered in the aftermath, marking the path of panic and tragedy. This wasn't the first time a stampede had happened during Hajj, and the Saudi authorities faced massive criticism for failing to prevent another disaster. The pressure was on to revamp the entire crowd control system. In response, they went all in. The Jamarat Bridge got a major upgrade with more levels, wider walkways, better signage, and high-tech surveillance systems to monitor and manage crowd movement. They introduced better scheduling systems to spread out the flow of pilgrims, reducing the likelihood of deadly congestion. The 2006 stampede was a wake-up call, one that showed how even the most sacred and well-intentioned events could spiral into catastrophe, if not handled with extreme care. The lesson was loud and clear. When you've got millions of people moving through tight spaces, precision isn't optional. It's everything. Even small missteps, like a stray suitcase or a momentary trip, can snowball into disaster on a massive scale. What made the tragedy even more heartbreaking was the sheer humanity of it all. These weren't just statistics or faceless crowds. These were people who had saved their entire lives, traveled across the globe, and were fulfilling one of the most significant spiritual milestones in their faith. Many were elderly. Many had waited decades for the chance to stand in that very spot. And in the midst of that deeply personal and spiritual journey, they found themselves caught in a crush of panic and confusion. The tragedy didn't just leave physical damage, it left a psychological mark on everyone who witnessed it. The image of white-robed pilgrims helping one another, desperately trying to pull people from the chaos, and offering prayers in the aftermath became symbols of both heartbreak and resilience. The reforms that followed were necessary, but they came at the cost of lives. Since then, every year during Hajj, those reforms have been put to the test. More effort goes into planning, spacing, and protecting the pilgrims. And while challenges still exist, the 2006 stampede remains a grim reminder of what happens when things go wrong. It was a moment in history marked not just by tragedy, but by the determination to make sure such horror is never repeated. Let's rewind to October 2nd, 1992, São Paulo, Brazil. A day that turned one of the world's most overcrowded prisons into the site of one of the deadliest prison massacres in modern history. Welcome to the twisted, tragic tale of Carandiru Penitentiary, where a prison brawl escalated into a full-blown bloodbath, all thanks to a keep calm and call the military approach that went spectacularly wrong. Now, Carandiru wasn't your average prison. It was more like a chaotic, concrete jungle crammed with over 8,000 inmates, all squeezed into a space built for way fewer. Picture wall-to-wall prisoners, barely enough room to breathe, and the kind of living conditions that would make even a cockroach file a complaint. Diseases were rampant, the food was tragic, and the vibe? Perpetual tension. You didn't need a crystal ball to see something bad was brewing. And then, boom, a fight breaks out in Pavilion 9, which was already known as the Hot Mess Express of the entire facility. This wasn't an unusual event. Fights were basically part of the daily itinerary, but this one spiraled fast. The prison staff hit panic mode, lost control, and instead of trying to calm things down, they did what any totally not overreacting system would do. They called in the military police. Because when your overcrowded prison explodes into chaos, what could go wrong with storming in hundreds of armed officers? Well, a lot. Over 300 military police officers entered the prison, and what was supposed to be a security operation turned into a slaughter. When the dust settled, 111 prisoners were dead, most of them unarmed, many reportedly executed in cold blood. Some were gunned down in their cells, others were shot while trying to surrender. And the kicker? Not a single cop was killed or seriously hurt. That wasn't a clash. It was a massacre in every sense of the word. Leading this little horror show was Colonel Uberatan Guimarães, who somehow went from guy who led a bloodbath to politician with a seat in office. He was convicted for his role years later. But don't cheer yet because the conviction got overturned. And in a plot twist straight out of a crime drama, he was found dead in 2006 under mysterious circumstances. No spoilers, but yeah, things got messy. The massacre triggered outrage both inside and outside Brazil. Human rights groups were furious. Journalists and activists sounded the alarm. The justice system was dragged through the mud for how long it took to hold anyone accountable. And even when some officers were finally put on trial, 2 decades later, the process felt more like a confusing soap opera than real justice. Carandiru itself was eventually shut down in 2002 and demolished. In its place stands a park and a memorial, a quiet tribute to the lives lost in a building that became a symbol of everything wrong with the prison system. Oh, and if this story sounds like something straight out of a gritty movie, that's because it is. In 2003, filmmaker Hector Babenco released Carandiru, a film that dives deep into prison life leading up to the massacre. It's raw, it's powerful, and it doesn't sugarcoat a thing. At the end of the day, the Carandiru massacre isn't just a dark moment in Brazil's past. It's a chilling reminder of what happens when authority loses its moral compass, and when lives behind bars are treated like they don't matter. It's brutal, it's real, and it's a story that demands to be remembered. It was the early hours of June 30th, 2024, in the quiet West Bank settlement of Kochaviakov. Inside one modest home, the Zahavi family slept. 2 parents, 9 children, unaware that everything was about to change. Then, just past 2:30 a.m., a sudden flash. An electric bicycle battery had caught fire. The flames were instant, brutal, and merciless. Smoke surged through the house like a tidal wave, thick and suffocating. One moment they were sleeping, the next they were fighting for their lives. Adina Zahavi, 45 years old, a mother of 9, was jolted awake. She didn't pause. There was no time. She and her husband Arye jumped into action as the fire roared around them. Their children, still groggy, some barely out of dreams, were lost in the chaos. The air was poison, visibility near zero. But through the black smoke, Adina had one thought, one instinct: get them out. All of them. She wasn't just running on fear. She was fueled by something far deeper: love. She moved from room to room, grabbing, guiding, shouting through the noise and heat. One by one, the children stumbled into the night air, coughing and crying, but alive. But Adina didn't stop. She could have. She could have stayed outside, safe, her job as a mother fulfilled. But she wasn't done. She ran back inside. Then again. The smoke thickened. The fire grew angrier. She kept going. By the time the last child was out, Adina didn't emerge. She had made it just far enough. The toxic fumes, the unbearable heat, it caught up to her. She collapsed before help could reach her. Paramedics fought to bring her back, but it was too late. She was gone. The shock rippled through her family like aftershocks from a quake. Arye and several of the children were hospitalized for smoke inhalation. Neighbors who tried to help were shaken. The house, everything they owned, was destroyed. But all 9 children survived. Because of her. Adina wasn't just a mother. She was the quiet kind of hero that never asks to be noticed. She had immigrated to Israel from the US years earlier, building a life filled with meaning. She worked with special needs students, mentored young people, and opened her home to anyone who needed a place to feel safe. She wasn't loud about her kindness. She just was, reliable, strong, endlessly compassionate. Even when life was hard, raising 9 kids, stretched thin, pregnant, and exhausted, she made time for others. Late-night drives just to check in on a friend. Heart-to-hearts over tea, a warm smile that made you feel like you mattered. That's what made her final act so heartbreakingly true to who she was. She didn't hesitate, not once. Her friend Rachel later said, she never looked for praise. She just did what needed to be done. And in those final minutes, what needed to be done was everything. She gave it all. After the fire, the community was shaken. The head of the Binyamin Regional Council visited the ruins and could barely speak through the grief. She didn't think twice, he said. She was a lioness. Her husband, dazed but alive, simply repeated the truth everyone already knew. She put her children before herself. Always had, always would. At her funeral, her brother stood over her grave, stunned. Who would have thought the first family funeral I'd attend would be hers? He asked, his voice breaking. Her children, now motherless, held one another close, trying to understand how the heartbeat of their home was suddenly gone. The questions still linger. Could the fire have been prevented? Could she have made it out? Could something, anything, have saved her? But for all the what-ifs, there's one truth that echoes louder. She chose them. In her final moments, she didn't run. She turned back into the fire, again and again. And because she did, 9 lives continued. Adina Zahavi's story is not just a tragedy. It's a testament, a reminder that real courage isn't loud or flashy. Sometimes it's a mother stepping back into a burning house, not for glory, but for love. She gave everything she had. Her legacy will live on in every life she saved and every heart she touched. Because heroes don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they wear pajamas, stand barefoot on cold tile floors, and make the choice no one should ever have to make. And sometimes they don't come back. On the night of December 31st, 2008, the Santika Club in Bangkok, Thailand, was packed with people eager to ring in the new year. It was a scene filled with flashing lights, thumping music, and the excitement of celebrating what was supposed to be a fresh start. But just hours into the celebration, disaster struck. Around 1 a.m., Fireworks, part of the New Year's festivities, ignited flammable materials on the club's ceiling, sparking a devastating fire. In an instant, the nightclub was engulfed in flames. The panic that followed was immediate and chaotic. The club, known for its vibrant atmosphere, had a major design flaw: narrow exits and overcrowding. These issues, combined with inadequate fire safety measures, created a deadly combination. As the fire spread rapidly, those inside found themselves with few options for escape. The smoke thickened, the heat intensified, and many couldn't make it out in time. When the fire was finally put out, the damage was clear. At least 67 people lost injured, many of them severely. The loss was felt deeply throughout Bangkok and beyond, as people realized just how close to disaster they had been. What was meant to be a night of joy became one of sorrow and loss. The aftermath of the Santika Club fire was a wake-up call for the city and the nation. Investigations revealed a shocking series of safety violations. The club had exceeded its maximum capacity, and fire exits were either blocked or poorly marked. The fire alarm system was either malfunctioning or completely absent. These critical oversights contributed to the severity of the tragedy, highlighting how easily a celebratory night could turn catastrophic due to a lack of proper safety measures. The fire not only raised questions about the safety standards in place at nightclubs, but it also revealed serious lapses in enforcement and oversight. How could a club operating in one of Asia's busiest cities be allowed to function under such dangerous conditions? The public outcry that followed led to tighter regulations and increased scrutiny of entertainment venues across Thailand. The Santika Club fire became a symbol of the consequences of negligence and the need for urgent reform. It served as a stark reminder that safety must always come first, no matter the occasion. The tragedy also sparked changes in fire safety regulations and emergency response strategies, particularly in crowded venues, ensuring that future events would be safer for everyone involved. For many, the memory of that night remains haunting. It's a sobering reminder that no amount of excitement or celebration can justify putting lives at risk. The Santika fire was a pivotal moment, one that led to tangible changes in how safety is handled in places where large numbers of people gather. As we reflect on the lives lost that night, we also remember the importance of vigilance and responsibility, both in maintaining safe environments and in honoring the lives of those we lost to prevent a similar tragedy from happening again. One of the most shocking and brutal prison riots in Brazil's recent history, the Altamira prison riot of 2019. This wasn't just a scuffle behind bars. It was a full-scale eruption of violence, fueled by gang rivalry, overcrowding, and a prison system that was already hanging by a thread. What happened in Altamira shocked the world, and for good reason. So, it all started on July 29, 2019, in the Centro de Recuperação Regional de Altamira, located in the northern state of Pará, Brazil. On the surface, it was a typical morning inside the facility, at least as typical as things can be in an overcrowded prison. But beneath the surface, tension was bubbling between two major rival gangs, the local Comando Class A, CCA, and the nationally feared Comando Vermelho, CV, from Rio de Janeiro. At around 7 a.m., that tension exploded into violence. Members of the CCA launched a surprise attack on CV members, catching them off guard. But this wasn't just fists and threats. The attackers locked a group of CV members in a section of the prison and set it on fire. Flames tore through the makeshift cell blocks, many of which were modified shipping containers, and smoke filled the air. The heat was intense and the fire quickly spread out of control. The result? Absolute horror. 57 inmates died inside the prison, many due to smoke inhalation, but at least 16 were brutally decapitated. That level of violence is hard to even imagine. The aftermath was worse. 4 more inmates died during transportation to other facilities, bringing the final death toll to 62. The riot wasn't just deadly, it was savage. Prison staff were powerless to stop it. There were only 33 guards overseeing more than 340 inmates that day, more than double the prison's intended capacity of 163. 2 staff members were briefly taken hostage during the chaos but were later released. For hours, police forces and emergency responders couldn't even get inside the building due to the flames and the violence still unfolding. It was a complete breakdown of control. This riot didn't come out of nowhere. It was the product of years of neglect, systemic overcrowding, poor infrastructure, and unchecked gang influence within Brazil's prisons. The conditions at Altamira were a disaster waiting to happen. When you cram hundreds of gang-affiliated inmates into a small, understaffed space and then house them in flammable, poorly ventilated units, it's not a question of if something will go wrong, but when. In the days that followed, authorities scrambled to respond. 46 inmates were transferred to other facilities, 10 of them to high-security prisons. Officials promised to review prison conditions and address gang-related violence, but for many critics it was too little, too late. This riot wasn't the first, and sadly, it wasn't the last. Brazil's prison system has long struggled with violence, overcrowding, and corruption. The Altamira massacre forced the world to take a hard look at what was happening behind closed doors. It became a symbol, not just of a failed facility, but of a failed system. And until those root causes are addressed, incidents like this will continue to happen. So, while it's easy to see this as just another headline from a faraway place, the Altamira riot is a harsh reminder of what can happen when broken systems are ignored. It's not just a story about criminals behind bars. It's a story about policy, humanity, and the high cost of neglect. It was January 13, 1982, and Washington, D.C. was caught in the grip of a brutal snowstorm. Despite the dangerous conditions, Air Florida Flight 90 was cleared for takeoff from Washington National Airport, bound for Miami. The flight had already been delayed, and the plane had been de-iced, but with the hours dragging on and fresh snow falling, more ice had begun to silently creep back onto its wings. Among the 79 passengers was 46-year-old Arland D. Williams, Jr., a quiet, dependable bank examiner from Georgia, a man who'd been through a lot: divorce, the challenges of single fatherhood, and the weight of responsibility. Still, he stayed grounded, committed to his kids, his work, and was even preparing for a second chance at love. This trip was just supposed to be routine, a work trip, nothing more. But fate had something else in store. At 4:01 p.m., the plane roared down the icy runway and lifted into the stormy sky. Something was wrong. Immediately, the engine strained and the aircraft trembled as it failed to gain altitude. The co-pilot suggested aborting. Too late. Just seconds later, the Boeing 737 clipped the 14th Street Bridge, crushing cars in its path, and then slammed into the frozen Potomac River. Out of the 79 souls on board, only 6 survived the impact. They were battered, soaked, and clinging desperately to the wreckage in the freezing water. It was pure chaos. The current was strong, the temperatures deadly, and every second mattered. Arland Williams was one of those survivors, injured but alert, and while panic consumed the scene, Williams did something that no one expected. He put everyone else first. On the shore, horrified bystanders called for help, watching helplessly as the broken pieces of the plane bobbed in the icy river. A hospital worker, Roger Olean, tied a rope around his waist and tried to swim to the wreckage, but the current was merciless. Then, about 20 minutes after the crash, salvation arrived in the sky. A U.S. Park Police helicopter known as Eagle One, piloted by Donald Usher with paramedic Melvin Windsor on board. The helicopter hovered low, battling the wind and sleet, and lowered a lifeline to the survivors. Williams grabbed it, but instead of securing himself, he handed it off, again and again. First, to flight attendant Nikki Felch, then to another survivor. He passed that rope not once, not twice, but every single time it came his way. He even gave a flotation ring to a woman who had drifted from the wreckage, helping her stay afloat. In those final minutes, his only focus was on the people around him. He was the strongest one left, but never thought of saving himself. The helicopter returned again and again. Each time, Williams deferred. Each time, he chose someone else, and then he was gone. When Eagle 1 made its final return, Arland Williams had disappeared beneath the icy surface. The man who had been fully capable of saving himself had instead sacrificed his life so that others could live. The 5 other survivors owed their lives to his choice, his calm, his courage, his absolute selflessness. News of the crash and Williams' heroism quickly spread across the country. At first, no one even knew his name. The press called him the man in the water. But when authorities finally identified him, the story became even more haunting. He wasn't a superhero. He was a father, a fiancé, a regular man with an ordinary job. But in the most terrifying moment imaginable, he became extraordinary. President Ronald Reagan posthumously awarded him the Coast Guard's Gold Life-Saving Medal, and his name was etched into history. His hometown of Mattoon, Illinois named a school after him. Washington, D.C. renamed the very bridge the plane struck, the 14th Street Bridge, as the Arland D. Williams Jr. Memorial Bridge. His alma mater, the Citadel, established a society in his honor to recognize exceptional service and created a professorship bearing his name. There's one haunting thought that lingers. What if he had held on to that rope? What if, just once, he had chosen to save himself, but that wasn't who? In July 2018, what was supposed to be a dreamy day of island hopping in Phuket, Thailand, turned into a tragic nightmare. On the afternoon of July 5th, the skies looked a little moody, but 2 tourist boats still set out to sea. One of them, the Phoenix, carried 89 people, mostly Chinese tourists, eager for a sunny day of snorkeling and sightseeing. The other boat, Serenita, had 42 people on board and was on a similar route. Both were sailing despite official weather warnings about an incoming storm. As the boats made their way back toward Phuket in the late afternoon, the sea turned hostile. Waves swelled, winds howled, and the ocean began throwing a full-blown tantrum. The Serenita managed to survive the storm, returning to shore with drenched but unharmed passengers. The Phoenix, however, wasn't so lucky. Battling violent waves near Koh Hei, Coral Island, it capsized and sank, leaving dozens of passengers tossed into the churning sea. Emergency services launched a high-stakes rescue mission involving divers, helicopters, and patrol boats. The conditions were brutal, with rough waves and murky water making every minute count. Divers searched the sunken wreckage under immense pressure. When the operation finally ended, 47 people had lost their lives, nearly all of them Chinese nationals. It became one of the worst maritime disasters in Thailand's recent history. The aftermath unfolded in a storm of grief, frustration, and action. The Phoenix should not have been out at sea in the first place. Investigations pointed to a chain of preventable issues. The tour company ignored storm alerts. The crew lacked proper training, and the boat itself raised serious concerns about seaworthiness. Reports highlighted structural flaws in the Phoenix and questioned the lack of life jackets and proper safety equipment. The vessel, it turned out, had more holes in its protocol than a slice of Swiss cheese. The Thai government was thrust into the spotlight, along with the tour operators and maritime authorities. Arrests were made, including the captain and the tour company's owner. Public pressure mounted, especially from Chinese officials and the victims' families, pushing for accountability. Authorities in Phuket scrambled to tighten regulations, enforce vessel inspections, and clean up the mess left behind by years of lax oversight. In the wake of the disaster, the tourism industry in Thailand took a serious hit, particularly with Chinese travelers who had once made up a large portion of the country's tourist base. Confidence had been shaken. Sweeping changes were introduced. Stricter rules, mandatory safety checks, and weather monitoring protocols became more than just optional suggestions. Despite the tropical setting, the incident cast a long, dark shadow over Thailand's tourism industry. The image of the Phoenix, lying broken beneath the waves, served as a powerful symbol of what can go wrong when warnings are ignored and corners are cut. The victims' families mourned deeply, while the nation wrestled with the consequences of putting business ahead of basic safety. Phuket, with its turquoise waters and picture-perfect beaches, still attracts thousands every year. But beneath the surface, the memory of that tragic day in July lingers. The legacy of the Phoenix continues to shape safety reforms and remains a chilling reminder that the sea, beautiful as it is, demands respect. In the end, it wasn't just a storm that caused the tragedy. It was the storm of negligence, overconfidence, and avoidable mistakes that sank the Phoenix and changed the tide of Thai tourism forever.